Horror Movie Syllabus intro, take one. And action!
This week at the Horror Movie Syllabus, we're talking horror action. So we're going to get a little bit of a and a little bit of a and a little bit of
Okay. Stop. That's enough. That is terrible.
But it's horror action.
More like horrible action.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below. It'll give you a pretty good idea of what the syllabus is all about, but in short, we look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to examine. Today, the subgenre we're looking at is horror action. And right off the bat, we kind of have to acknowledge that horror action is a potentially made up subgenre. Really, when we look at horror action movies, we're really looking at action movies that have horror elements in it by and large, as opposed to maybe horror movies that have action elements in it, which are, many movies. The horror action subgenre would maybe, not unlike the horror sci-fi subgenre, be better called action horror because the action does seem to be front and center in these movies. In fact, I kind of expect many of you to quibble with calling these horror movies at all. I think a lot of people will think of these movies as just action movies. And again, maybe they'll acknowledge there are some horror elements in there, but they're generally considered action movies. And maybe the best way to reinforce that point is how commercially accessible and mainstream these movies tend to be. It's interesting because I always think of the horror genre as a whole as something of a niche genre when we're talking about the general public, right? These movies are rarely blockbuster hits. They have a certain audience that is small relative to, say, the rest of the world, the rest of the movie-going public. And so horror movies tend to be a niche market in my mind, but action movies is a far broader market with far broader appeal. A lot more people see action movies. So when you get to horror action movies, they seem like they follow along the more action trend in terms of marketability, in terms of accessibility, than they do with horror films. In other words, they tend to be more popular. They tend to make more money. They tend to be more mainstream. And so that's why I think people tend to think of them as action movies. But I think, this is a personal opinion, obviously, but I think that a lot of the attitude about it is that people will say things like they don't like horror, but they like action movies. So they'll want to categorize these movies as action movies because they don't like horror. So they would say, oh, but this is not a horror movie, it's an action movie. And you know how I feel about this. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the thriller movies and how I feel like it's just kind of semantics. They're basically horror movies that people want to elevate a little bit or not admit that they're horror movies and kind of call them something else, so they'll call them thriller movies. And I feel like a similar thing happens here. The horror action movie is undeniably an action movie where the action tends to be front and center, but there are undeniable horror elements to it that make it different from the average action movie. The movies that we talk about today are going to be different than, say, a Fast and Furious movie or even like a Matrix or an Indiana Jones film. There's a different feel to these movies, and it's because of the horror elements. And I think even the biggest action fans would be able to admit that these movies have a different feel. They have a different sensibility, if you will, because of these elements. So that's why I felt justified in making the horror action subgenre and adding it to the syllabus, and why I feel justified in putting these movies in the subgenre. Also, I like these movies, so I wanted an opportunity to talk about them. So having the horror action subgenre was a good outlet for doing this because while most, if not all of these movies could fit in other subgenres, it's nice to have them here because, again, the action is a major thrust to the movie. It's a major component of it. And this way they don't take up a spot that could go to another movie, frankly. In terms of filling out the syllabus, you can only use each movie once, and having these movies be in a different subgenre would mean another movie might have to not make the syllabus that I'd want it to make. So this was, you know, a little bit of a bias on my part, but I wanted these movies in here. And I think when you see the movies we picked, you'll think of them as action movies probably, but you'll understand, you know, why you could call them horror or make a case for them being horror, especially considering how broadly we treat horror here at the Horror Movie Syllabus. You know, we want to call everything horror because, well, why not? It's fun. It gives us an opportunity to talk about it. So that's where we're at with this. So if you feel like these are more action than horror, that's fine. But I'm gonna make the case for it, and either you're with us for the ride or you're not. Hopefully you are, because I think we're gonna have a really good time. Now, as usual, we're going to organize these in undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level. And in this case, we're going to do them just in the order how much I like them. Like I said, I admitted that this subgenre is here partly because I just really like these movies. So we're just going to go ahead and go with lean into that. How much do I like these movies? So let's go ahead and get into action right now. The first movie that we're looking at today, the undergraduate level selection, is Underworld. Underworld came out in 2003 and is wearing its influences on its sleeve. It clearly has Matrix envy, as it came out a few years after that, and also has a little bit of Shakespearean aspirations. But in reality, it winds up mixing it out to being its own thing, leading to a rather successful franchise with I don't know if I'd call it a rabid fan base, but a pretty loyal fan base, all things considered. But we'll get into all of that as we dig into this film. If you haven't seen it before, the movie stars Cade Beckinsale as a vampire death dealer. Basically, this group of vampires, an elite force that is out to kill lichens, which are basically werewolves and the sworn enemy of the vampires for centuries. And she comes across a human being that the lichens have interest in, and a romance buds out of this, out of this unlikely meeting with this human who apparently is very important to both sides. And it's a mystery that starts to unravel as she pulls at the threads and finds that maybe she hasn't been told the complete truth about the history of the vampire lichen war. And you know, I will stop there so as to not spoil too many of the details for you, and to not get too stuck into the mythology of this movie, because it's pretty dense. It's a movie that is probably style over substance in terms of how it looks and how it's shot and the aesthetic of the movie. But for a movie that it's more style over substance, has a tremendous amount of mythology folded into it. So it's an interesting mix of the movie. Now, like I mentioned, it's definitely got Matrix envy. It comes out a few years after the Matrix. And if you look at the design of the characters, the costuming, the whole look of it, aside from like the blue swath of color that permeates throughout the entire film, it's very Matrix looking, you know, with the latex and the leather and everything. It very much has a Matrix sensibility, which, you know, does not make it unique. There was a lot of Matrix wannabes post-Matrix. It was a very influential film. And so, you know, it's wearing that influence on its sleeve, but it also is it was billed as a Romeo and Juliet type story. You've got two groups of people, the vampires and the lichens, you know, werewolves, and they're at war. They've been at war for forever. And then you have this, you know, vampire woman and this human who has some sort of connection to the lichens that, you know, fall in love. And it's supposed to be like this Romeo and Juliet thing. It has some very serious aspirations here. But I would say that the Romeo and Juliet part of it really falls flat for two reasons. The first is that the movie is also trying to fold in a tremendous amount of mythology. Like I said, for a style over substance movie, there's a lot of mythology that they're trying to introduce here. And it's a little convoluted. It's a little bit much. Not so much, I think, that you can't enjoy the film or even follow it, but it's ambitious. And when you're trying to do that and at the same time fold in a Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet story, you got a lot on your plate. As a result, I think the love story gets a little bit of short shrift because they really want to focus on this mythology, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I think the mythology is probably the more interesting thing to be focusing on because of the second reason why I think the Romeo and Juliet thing doesn't work, which is the chemistry between the leads, or rather the lack thereof. Cade Beckinsale is a good actress. I like her. And then Scott Speedman, who plays Michael the Human, is fine, I guess. You know, he was in Felicity, whatever. But they don't really sell me on the star-crossed lovers thing. It doesn't really hit for me. And so maybe the producers and the director, Glenn Wiseman, kind of recognize that. I don't know. But as a result, they're folding more of the mythology in there, and that starts to take more center stage, and it's probably the more interesting thing about the movie. The vampire and war stuff is good. If you like vampires, which I do, and if you like, werewolves, which I do, this stuff is cool. This stuff is fun. And they're not above, breaking up the mythology and the story with some cool action set pieces. Again, style over substance. So there's a lot of cool looking people looking really edgy and doing some cool actiony stuff. And surprisingly, and I didn't know this until I looked into some of the behind the scenes stuff, the the majority of the effects are practical. There is definitely CGI in here. Don't get me wrong, but they went out of their way to do a lot of more practical stuff than I would have expected, which makes the movie hold up better than you would think. Frankly, it looks good. It looks really good. Now it's a sign of its times. Like I said, it's post Matrix, and it looks like a post Matrix movie, but it looks good. It's a solid movie. I don't want to oversell it and say that it's amazing, but it's a good movie. And obviously, I'm not alone in that mentality because this spawned a whole franchise of films. Now the franchise's quality varies, and it also is a matter of opinion. I know some people who think that some of the sequels at least, are better than the original. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but maybe because they have sequels, they have prequels, and they really do kind of put the back seat on the Romeo and Juliet stuff and really delve into the mythology, which has its pros and its cons. The pros being that the mythology is kind of neat and interesting. Again, if you're a fan of this kind of stuff, you're going to be into this. The cons being that it is convoluted. It is a little bit tricky. Some of the dates start to not make sense. If you look at it a little too closely, it's not going to make a lot of sense. So pros and cons when it comes to the mythology of it, but I appreciate that they were ambitious with this. They tried to do something more than just glossy action movies. They took horror themes, vampires, werewolves, they took horror monsters and folded them into an action movie with Shakespearean overtones. Again, ambitious. Does it 100% succeed? No, not really. It's probably a little bit more on par with like the Resident Evil movies, which isn't a bad thing. They're probably better than those movies, frankly. But it's not a work of art or anything like that. But they have some actors in there that do kind of elevate things a little bit. They've got Bill Nighy in there, got Michael Sheen. They're chewing scenery. They're being really big, but they're making the movies better than they probably should be, frankly. And so I do appreciate that there's a lot of effort or love behind the scenes trying to make these movies good, and I think it shows. I think it pays off. There's a budget. There's talent both on camera and behind the camera. There's a high quality to this film that it frankly probably doesn't deserve because it's kind of a B movie. It's kind of a cheesy flick, but with better production values than most cheesy flicks, and as a result, winds up being really good, winds up being really popular. Again, action film more than horror film to most people probably. So a lot of people probably see this and don't really think of it as horror or true horror. So we'll call it horror action. I do think the movie is fun. I think the franchise is mostly fun. I don't think I've seen the last one that just came out a little while ago, but I've seen all the other ones and they're good. They're fine. None of them blow me away. None of them really make me angry. They're all good. They'll get a passing grade. But if anything, check out the first one and see if you like it. If you like it, I'd say check out the rest of them because they're kind of on the same level. And if you don't like it, it's not for you. You can just stop right there. But I'm guessing a lot of you've seen Underworld and have some opinions on it. So by all means, share those in the comments below and we'll keep talking about it. I know that not everybody loves this movie. A lot of people do think it's a little cheesy or falls short or wish it was something more. I wish it was something a little bit more too. I think they could have done more with it, but I'm pleased with what we got. I'm pleased that they managed to do as well as they did with it. So for me, it scratches the itch. I enjoy it quite a bit, and I'd like to hear if you guys liked it. The next movie that we're talking about today, the graduate level selection, is Predator. Predator came out in 1987 and is a bona fide action classic, and I would contend horror action classic, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger at the height of his popularity, and is a great action film starring one of the most original, unique, and interesting horror monsters possibly ever. And so that's why I'm putting it here for sure, but we're going to get into all of that in just a second. Now, if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't seen it, The movie is about a group of American soldiers who are sent to Central America to rescue some hostages. Only when they get out there, they find that the mission isn't what they expected it to be, but that's not even the biggest of their problems because they find that people in the jungle are being killed by an unseen, seemingly invisible creature that they don't know what it is. They don't know what it's about. They don't know what it's trying to do, but they do know that it's dangerous and they know that it bleeds. And if it bleeds, they can kill it. And I'm going to stop there in case for some reason you haven't seen Predator. But if you haven't seen Predator, by all means, you should see Predator. Predator is an amazing film. Like I said, it's an action classic. It's definitely one of those must-see action movies. And maybe not a must-see horror film because, again, it really leans heavily into action. But the design of the Predator, the creature, is amazing. It is an incredible, incredible design. Second, in my opinion, only to the movie that we're about to talk about next. In terms of design, it's just that good. And the characters in the movie, led by Arnold Schwarzenegger, are absolutely fantastic. You've got Shane Black, you've got Jesse Ventura, you've got all of these, Bill Duke, Carl Weathers, all of these memorable characters that are, they're kind of throwaway characters. Spoiler alert, most of them going to die, but they are memorable. They, with a short amount of screen time, all make an impression. Every one of them is memorable and will stick with you, and they matter. And that is, I think, the key to making a good movie, both a good horror movie and a good action movie. Even though the cannon fodder are gonna die, you feel for them, you like them, you remember them. Now, this is not a big surprise if you realize it is directed by John McTiernan, who directed probably the greatest action movie of all time, Die Hard. He has a very good way of making his characters, even the small characters, even the throwaway characters, memorable and interesting. It really adds something to the film so that when people are dying, it's not just forgettable, mindless death. It actually has some of an impact because you kind of know and like these characters. So it's a really good way of taking the movie seriously, taking the action seriously, taking the horror, the killing seriously. I really, really like that. I think it's a key part to what makes this movie so, so good. Again, the creature design is number one. The characters are number two. And it really is a showcase for Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you're not really familiar with his work, this is a great one to check out. We've talked about him once before because we talked about the Terminator. And I do love the Terminator, probably more than this one, but that's splitting hairs because they're both great films. And again, both of them arguably more action-y, arguably more science fiction-y, but both of them have these horror elements. And in this case, it's the Predator itself. The creature itself is flat out from horror, flat out monster. And it's fantastic. It really is. Now, again, I'm not alone in these thoughts because this is a very popular franchise, for better or for worse. The franchise has been very uneven. There's been some high points. A lot of people like part two, even though it wasn't very popular at the time, but it really kind of grew in popularity. But a lot of the other installments have fallen short. But at the time of this recording, the most recent one just came out, Prey, which was absolutely fantastic. I liked Prey very, very much. Arguably as good as the original. I know that might be controversial to some people, but I might like it a little bit more than the original. I really need to stop and think about that a little bit, but I really enjoyed the latest installment. I think it's probably the second best for sure, if not the best installment in the franchise, which again, high praise because the original Predator is a bona fide classic. If you haven't seen it, again, you should check it out right away. The rest of the series, hard for me to say. Mileage may vary on that one, but the original is a classic and you should check it out. If you haven't seen it before, please do check it out. Let me know what you think. But I'm, again, guessing most of you have seen at least the first Predator, and I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I'd be surprised if there are people out there that really dislike Predator. There might be some people that it's not really for them, not really into action, not really into military stuff. That's cool. That's fine. But if you dislike Predator, I'd like to know why. Like, what falls short for you? Because I feel like the movie is pretty tight, pretty flawless. It really does hit all the right beats, all the right notes. It's made really well. It's written really well. It's acted rather well, even by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's not the best thespian in the world. But I think all of the elements come together beautifully. So if you think something falls short, let us know in the comments below. We'll have a discussion about it. And the last movie that we're talking about today, the postgraduate level selection, is Aliens. This is my Alien box set. Aliens came out in 1986 and is another bona fide classic, bona fide action classic, bona fide sci-fi classic, bona fide horror classic. Admittedly a stretch, but you know, as I've been talking about all video, most of these movies, while they lean more into action, there really are horror elements that make it deserve to be discussed here, and this one definitely has that horror element in the actual Aliens. And you know, we'll get into it as we talk about the movie a little bit more, but you know, we talked about the Alien, we're definitely going to talk about Aliens. So let's talk about it. If you haven't seen it before, the movie picks up kind of where the first movie Alien left off, where Ripley has escaped the alien and destroyed her ship, and she is found and rescued, but some time has passed, and they find out that the place where they found the alien in the first movie has been colonized, and now the colony has lost contact with the rest of us. And so they send a group of Marines and Lieutenant Ripley to go and investigate what happened and see if they can determine whether or not any aliens have attacked. Spoiler alert, they have. And hijinks abound, as they tend to do. But I'll stop right there in case you haven't seen it. But once again, if you haven't seen Aliens, you got to see Aliens. You know, we talked previously about the movie Alien, which is a bona fide horror classic, and I don't get a lot of pushback from people saying that Alien is a horror movie. Yeah, it's very sci-fi, but it is a horror movie, and people pretty much agree on that point. But on this one, the sequel, it really is much more action heavy. So there are people who will make the argument that it's not really a horror movie, and frankly, I kind of understand that, because while I think that Alien is a bona fide horror classic, I think Aliens is a bona fide action classic. It's one of the best action movies of all time, in my opinion. But it's got some strong horror elements into it. And to kind of prove that point, I'll tell you, I saw this movie when it came out. So I'm probably, I don't know, 11 when this movie came out, 10 or 11. I was scared. I went with my father. He had to go make a phone call or something during the movie, and it was like right before the aliens first attack. And he left me by myself in the dark theater, and I was kind of freaked out by that. Man, I kind of like sunk into the chair and was kind of scared and stuff like that till he came back. So it does have the horror elements into it. You know, the alien design is pretty scary. It's pretty creepy. It's designed to be this ultimate killing machine. So it really is right up there with like a Jason or a Freddy or a Michael Myers in terms of, you know, how scary it is, how unstoppable it is, how it just lives to basically kill. And I think that, you know, even though it's kind of like a trope for a sequel to just make more and bigger, I think in this case it works really well, because the first Alien by itself, they killed a whole crew of people. It was really tough to beat. So the idea of there being multiple aliens, a bunch of them, was scary. I remember seeing the ads for this when it came out, and I was like, oh my God, like the idea of there being multiple aliens, but calling it aliens, plural of alien, it really was effective. As a kid, I was just like, how do you deal with that? You know? And so I think that this was the right way to go. Now, director James Cameron is owed a lot of the credit for this, because he's the one that creates not only this more actiony, bigger threat movie, but he also creates this aesthetic that really, really works. It just looks, everything looks lived in and real. The from the equipment to the weapons to the clothing, everything feels very authentic, very lived in, very real. And then, not unlike John McTiernan with Predator, he gives you a bunch of characters that are extremely memorable. Extremely memorable. You've got this cast of characters that, cast of actors that are brilliant. From Michael Biehn, the great Bill Paxton, Lance Henriksen. There are so many people in this movie that make an impression, that are so memorable and are quotable, because there's so many great lines in this movie, and that's a big part of what makes this movie so wonderful and so popular. Now, it's one of those movies where there is a debate as to whether or not it's better than the original. It's at least kind of on par with the original. I go back and forth on this. Depending on my mood, will say Alien is the best, then I'll say Aliens is the best. As of this recording, right now I'm on Aliens is the best. And the reason I give it the edge is that quotability. Like, There are some good lines in Alien, but there's nowhere near as many good quotable lines as there are in Aliens. And if you think that's a weird or dumb reason for giving it giving it over Alien, that's my point. Is they are so even to me, so evenly matched, so evenly beloved to me that all it takes is one little thing to push one over the edge. And again, my mood will change, and at some point I'll go back to Alien because I love both of them dearly, dearly. Now there is a whole franchise of these movies that follow on this, and it's diminishing returns. I do like all the movies, but none of them touch these first two. None of them. And I have this deep affection for the first two movies. And I think that, not only am I not alone on this, but I think that when it comes to Aliens, especially Aliens, there's more cultural significance to this than just liking a really good action movie. And that is Sigourney Weaver's Ripley. I mean, she is a feminist icon, a big one. And while it starts in Alien, make no mistake, Aliens is where it's solidified. Aliens is where she becomes a bona fide action hero. She is tough. She kicks ass. She is an icon. And there's no way around that. It is a very important movie because of that importance, because of that character's importance, that character's significance, and without losing her femininity, without losing her connection to motherhood, a womanhood. There's a whole theme of that going throughout the movie that again elevates it from your standard action flick, your standard horror flick. It really is better than all that. But I mean, everything, the design of the aliens, the design of the world, the design of the ships and the weapons and the facility, all of it works. Everything in this movie works extremely well. The quality of this movie is so high. I mean, even Sigourney Weaver got an Oscar nomination for her performance. That's how high quality this movie is. So if you haven't seen this, you should see Alien first because it really does pick up where Alien left off. But you should absolutely see this movie. But again, this is one of those movies that's very mainstream, very popular, and people probably don't think of it too much as horror. Even I barely think of it as horror, if I'm being really honest. But I'm sure y'all have seen it, so let us know what you think of that too, because I love talking about these movies. There's an extended director's cut. Do you think the director's cut is better or worse than the theatrical cut? Because I have thoughts on that. Let's talk about that in the comments below. But let me know what your thoughts are on this Aliens, which one you like better, and how do you think about the rest of the series? Lots to talk about, and I love talking about Aliens, so let's continue that in the comments below. So that's going to do it for our exploration into the horror action subgenre. But if you like these kind of movies, and obviously I do, I've got a few extra credit ones for you to check out as well. The first one I'm going to mention is a movie called Priest. Priest came out in 2011 and is based on a Korean comic book of the same name that I've never read, but you can kind of tell that it's got its comic book sensibilities. It's got a comic book aesthetic, comic book feel, comic book story. It got that comic book whole vibe to it, but I still think it's worth mentioning here as horror action because of vampires. Now, if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't seen it, the movie takes place in this dystopian kind of alternate reality, alternate universe where vampires are real and humans and vampires have been at war for a long time, and the church created this group of people called priests that were kind of empowered to kill vampires, and they've kind of wiped them out. Only now there seems to be an uprising, some vampires, and the church doesn't want to admit it, but a former priest played by Paul Bettany is invested in going to check this out because his family has been attacked by this outpost of vampires. So he defies the church and go in search of trying to rescue his niece from these vampires. And we'll stop there so as to not spoil the movie for you, even though plot-wise it's a little bit thin. It's got its comic book sensibilities all over the place, and I say that almost pejoratively, and I don't mean it to be that way. It's just, this is not like Marvel, MCU stuff. This is, kind of pre all that, even though it did come out, I think Marvel had already started their thing, but the movie is, it's got a kind of a thin comic book plot, but what it does have is a group of actors that are really good, starting with Paul Bettany in the lead, but it's also got Carl Urban and Maggie Q, Christopher Plummer, actors that, frankly elevate the material and are giving a better performance than the movie frankly deserves. It's a B movie. It's kind of schlocky, but I like it. I like the characters. I like the design of the vampires. They are very monstrous looking. They look more like creatures than like traditional vampires. There aren't no Twilight vampires. And I like the concept of this. I do wish they delved a little bit more into the religious aspect of it, the corruption of the church type thing. It kind of feels like they were setting up for sequels for a whole franchise where they would have gone into that a little bit more, but unfortunately that is not the case. And I'll be honest with you, the movie probably doesn't need a franchise. Like there's not a ton of meat on this bone, but that's okay. It's fun. It's got action scenes that I find enjoyable. It's got characters that are not deep, but they're enjoyable. Again, the actors are elevating it a little bit, with the weak link being Cam Giganta from, I believe, from Twilight. So, but if you manage your expectations, it's a good time. Is it a perfect movie? God, no. It's not a great movie. In fact, it's not a very popular movie. I might be on an island alone on this one. I enjoy Priest. I do think it's horror action. Again, vampires, they're pretty monstrous, but it's very actiony, very comic booky. But if you haven't seen it, I'd say give it a shot. If you like action, if you like comic books, give this one a shot. I've never felt compelled to go and seek out the Korean comic. I don't love it that much. I just like this movie. It's maybe more of a guilty pleasure, but I'm guessing some of you have seen it. And if you have, let me know what you think of it. Give me your thoughts on it. But if you haven't seen it, I'll give it a soft recommend. I think it's fun and kind of better than you would expect it to be, but it's not great. Now, the next extra credit movie I'm going to mention is The Mummy. And The Mummy came out in 1999 and is a remake of the Universal Monster movie of the same name, but it's a loose remake. It's very much more of an action-adventure movie than it is a horror movie like the original Universal Monster movie was. But that's an interesting take on things. If you haven't seen it, the movie follows the basic premise of the Universal Monster movie, Egyptian man with a great love, and she dies, and he dies, he gets mummified, and he comes back, and he's trying to bring her back. And it stars Brendan Fraser as this Indiana Jones type adventurer who is helping a woman and her brother basically hunt treasure, and they inadvertently raise the mummy from the dead and unleash him, and hijinks start to abound, as they tend to do in movies like this. And this one, the hijinks are a tremendous amount of fun because, again, it's a very action-adventure movie with a lot of great effects, CGI effects, so take that as you will. But this movie really leaned into the fun. Instead of the creepy horror aspects that the Universal Monster movie did, it really wanted to have a sense of adventure. And on that, it succeeds like gangbusters. When I first saw this movie, I don't know what it was I was expecting, but I didn't get what I was expecting from this. Maybe I wanted to be a little bit more serious, like the Indiana Jones series, because that's kind of what it looked like to me. And it really is kind of a fun and somewhat funny action adventure movie with these horror elements into it. But the horror elements work really, really well. Arno Vosloo playing the mummy is really wonderfully creepy as a villain. He's got a sense of sympathy to him, pathos that works really, really well. Brendan Fraser's chewing up scenery in the best possible way. He's a big part of why the movie works. Rachel Weisz as the love interest is wonderful as always because it's Rachel Weisz. But everybody here is doing really good work. Again, characters that you find likable and interesting. So even though the movie wasn't what I was expecting it to be when it came out, it won me over. I wound up liking it quite a bit. Now, it did franchise out, and I don't feel like the sequels live up to the promise of the original. I don't think any of them are particularly bad. They really do kind of feel more actiony than horror, even more so than the first one, which is saying quite a bit. But they're fun, they're interesting. One of them's got The Rock in it, so that's cool. But they're not, to me, as good as the original. I don't have the same affinity or affection for those as I do for the original one. And the original one does have a lot of affection. A lot of people still love that movie. For me, it doesn't really compare to the original Universal Monsters because, again, I like the horror of it better. But I do think the horror elements work in this one. I do think the action and adventure is fun in this movie. I can see why it's very popular. This is definitely one of those movies that people will say is not horror, and hard to argue with, even though there's some horrible scenes in it, horrific scenes, maybe not horrible, horrific. But I can see why people would say it's more action than horror for sure. But again, one of those things where it's mainstream and maybe people don't want to call it horror because it's so mainstream, but I mean, it's based on, it's a remake of a horror movie, from the 1930s. So it is definitely a horror action film. It definitely qualifies. And again, another one that you've probably seen. Let me know what your thoughts are on it. But if you haven't seen this one, it's a fun one. This is not going to scare you much, but it's a good time. It's a good ride. And the last extra credit movie I'm going to mention is a movie called Pitch Black. Pitch Black came out in 2000 and is a sci-fi horror action movie, but I feel this movie in particular really does nail the horror elements pretty strong, even though it's got a lot of sci-fi elements into it, a lot of action elements into it. I really feel like the horror comes out stronger in this one than most of the other movies we've talked about today, but I'll explain. If you haven't seen the movie before, the movie stars Vin Diesel as a character named Riddick, a criminal who's being transported on a freighter that winds up crash landing on a planet along with a bunch of other passengers that survive. And the planet is very sunny, but when the sun goes down, there is a bunch of creatures that live in the night. They're monsters, frankly, that are very vicious, very dangerous. But Riddick can see in the dark because of genetically enhanced eyes. And so he's going to try to save these passengers and lead them to safety, and avoiding all the hijinks that can be created by these crazy monsters, these crazy creatures, because the hijinks do definitely abound here. And we'll leave it at that so as to not spoil the movie too much, but I love Pitch Black. This was one of those movies that came out and it was kind of a surprise hit. It really kind of came out of nowhere. It was under the radar. People didn't really know who Vin Diesel was at the time. This is the movie that really kind of made him a star. And I remember seeing this because the person I saw it with was really into Vin Diesel, even though I didn't know really who he was. And I liked Rhoda Mitchell, who is the main female lead in the movie, because she'd done some art house films. I think she's grossly underrated. We talked about her a little bit with Silent Hill, and I think she's an underrated actress. And she's underrated in this movie as well. But the movie has a great cast of characters. Once again, memorable characters, but the big one is Vin Diesel's Riddick. That character is really, really good. It's kind of like Wolverine from the X-Men, just a character that's super cool, cooler than the rest of the stuff going on, and all you care about is him. And he is kind of the star of the movie, but it's really kind of an ensemble movie, but he just kind of takes it over. Vin Diesel's good in this movie. He really has the right charisma, the right menace to it. Like, you like him, but you're also kind of scared of him. And the idea of this character who's like a real badass, he's a killer, he's super dangerous, and he can see in the dark with these creepy eyes, but he has to wear goggles in the light because otherwise he can't see. It's a cool design, it's a cool character. And then the monsters he's fighting are just kind of scary. They're these flying kind of alien bat-like creatures that just come and snatch you and kill you. They're creepy, they're unsettling, they're dangerous, and they make for a really creepy setup. A really scary setup. Like, I mean, is this movie as scary as some of the, bona fide horror movie classics? Probably not, but it really has a lot more scariness to it than the average action flick or even the average sci-fi flick. I could have put this in the horror sci-fi as well, but I put it here because, Vin Diesel is an action star. This is a movie that made him into a star, and there's a lot of action in this movie. So I do think it fits here rather well. But again, the horror elements of this work really well for me. Now, what's interesting is the movie was a surprise hit. For a low-budget movie, it made a good chunk of change. So they, of course, decided to franchise it out. And when they made the sequel, they really doubled down on the sci-fi elements and kind of abandoned the horror elements. And as a result, the movie wasn't popular. Now, I don't know if that's because people wanted it to be more horror or just because they went really sci-fi, kind of like hard sci-fi with it. And it's okay. I didn't love it, but it's okay. But I think that I'm right. I think that people didn't respond to the hard sci-fi part of it. They wanted more of that horror action stuff because the third movie went back to that basics, went back to the horror sci-fi element. It really kind of felt almost like a reboot of the original. And so they wisely focused on the character of Riddick. So Riddick is the through line through all these movies, and he is the star of the other movies. So they at least got that part right. But that formula, that mix they had for Pitch Black was something that they should have tried to replicate a little bit better, and they just didn't do it as well as I would have liked in the sequels. But the original is fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. Now, maybe not everybody here has seen it, but if you haven't seen it and you like these kind of movies, definitely would highly recommend this one for you to check out, and then let me know what you think. But if you have seen Pitch Black, let me know your thoughts on it too. Did you like it? Did you think it falls short? Did you not find it as memorable? Because I like it a lot, but I might be a little bit biased on this one because this one hits me in a sweet spot. So let me know your thoughts on it down below. So that's going to do it for our video on horror action. You know, when we talk about these horror hybrid movies where they're horror and a hybrid with another genre, they tend to be more that other genre than horror. But I tend to like that. I tend to like that it gives, you know, the horror elements a different flavor or different feel by combining it with another genre. And I think it makes for some really good stuff. And this is definitely no exception to the rule. I really like these movies. And while they might be more action than horror, I definitely wanted to talk about them with you guys. I definitely wanted to highlight them. So hopefully you enjoyed the conversation, have something to contribute in the comments below. But for now, let's get into the horror trivia pursuit question of the week. As I get the glasses on, and we're going to look at the monster category on the card because a lot of what we talked about today are monsters. So let's dig into this question. What mutated insects threatened humanity in 1954's Them? Bees, ants, worms, or spiders? And I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't even want to read the multiple choice. I just wanted to leave it the way it was because, well, frankly, because I know the answer to it, but because I think that it's a fair question to ask without giving you multiple choice. I think that question is not needing the multiple choice. I think you could know the answer to this without the multiple choice if you have an affinity for old movies, because Them is a pretty famous one. If it were in scope of the syllabus, it would absolutely be something we would talk about because I saw this movie as a kid and it creeped me out so much, and it really shouldn't, which might give you a hint as to the answer. This movie should not creep me out, but it did. As a child, it creeped me out. I don't remember how old I was, but I was under 10 probably when I saw this movie. I remember seeing it at my grandmother's house. And yeah, just freaky. Like the effects for 1954, pretty good, man. And as a kid, you buy into it. You buy into these giant things, these giant insects. I won't spoil the answer just yet because I'm giving you some time to think about it. I know what the answer is, and I'm betting a lot of you do too. Like I said, Them is a pretty notorious, well-known horror flick from the 50s. You know, that whole post-radiation fear type thing, you know, nuclear war fear type thing, you know, giant whatever was definitely a concern, and it's enough of a concern it had that it maybe warrants its own subgenre, and since I'm working on a horror movie supplement, perhaps we'll be talking about this in the future. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. But let's get back to this one. I've given you enough time, I think. I've prattled on long enough for you to know. And you've got a 25% chance because you've got 4 different options here. Bees, ants, worms, or spiders, all of which I think have been in horror movies in one way or another. But I'll go ahead and give my answer now. Hopefully you've got yours locked in. The answer, of course, is ants. But we're going to double check it. And it's ants. You know, if you know the movie, you've even heard about it, you don't even have to see it. If you've heard about it, you know what that movie's about. Giant ants, which is kind of ridiculous. You shouldn't be afraid of ants. They're not really that creepy. They're more annoying. They're more of a nuisance than anything. But I was creeped out when I saw that as a kid. I haven't revisited that movie in a long time. Maybe it deserves a rewatch. Let me know. Have you guys seen it recently? Does it hold up, or will I screw it up if I watch it? Let me know. But thanks, guys, very much for hanging out. I hope you got the question right. And I hope you'll join us for next week when we do something different, but same vein as usual. We're talking horror. But I really appreciate you guys sticking around. I appreciate you guys dropping comments down below. And I'll talk to you guys next week. Until then, class dismissed.